This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Doug Bounds, state statistician for Kansas with the USDA, with a review of the 2022 Census of Agriculture. In this two-part interview, Doug covers how much land is in Kansas farms, as well as their economics and demographics. He also compares how 2022 looked in relation to 2017. Anthony Reardon, Johnson County horticulture agent, and Rebecca McMahon will be discussing selecting and planting fruit trees for Kansas on the March 6th K-State Garden Hour. Today, Anthony ends the show by providing a preview of how to plant and care for fruit trees. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing data from the Census of Agriculture. And then to talk about it, we're joined by state statistician for Kansas with the USDA, Doug Bounds. Doug, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
Doug, as we start talking about the Census of Agriculture, can you first just give us some background about how this is started and what data gets collected?
Sure. A little history on the Census of Agriculture. It's something that's been around since 1840. At that time, there are only 26 states in the Union. Most of our neighboring states were not admitted to the Union yet. Missouri, I believe, was the only one. There's been 30 Census of Agricultures conducted over the years. Most of those were conducted by the Census Bureau. If we go back to 1997, that was handed off to the USDA. So we've been doing the Census of Agriculture in-house since 1997.
And right now, we have the national, state, and county levels, and specifically looking at Kansas and some of the counties within Kansas today. And first, talking about farms and land and farms. And first, can you share with us the definition of what is a farm?
Yes, because that definition is very important. It dates back to 1974 when Congress defined what a farm is, or updated the definition of a farm, I should say. And since 1974, it has been considered to be any place from which $1,000 or more of agricultural products were produced and sold, or normally would have been sold during the year.
As we're looking at that definition now, looking at the number of farms and land and farms and how that's changed from 2017 to 2022.
The number of farms back in 2017 was about 58,600 farms. If we fast forward to 2022, we're down to 55,734 farms. That's about a loss of not quite 5%. If we look back further, go back to 2002, we've lost about 13.5% of our farms in Kansas in the last 20 years.
And in that land for those farms, do we have less land in farms?
Yes, we do. In 2017, we had about 45.8 million acres of land in farms within Kansas. And in 2022, that number's gone down about 1 million to 44.8 million. That's a decline of a little over 2%.
However, the average farm size is increasing?
That's correct. We see we're losing some small farms. The larger farms are making up a little more. So the average farm size in acres increased from 781 back in 2017 to 804 acres in 2022.
And a lot of these farms still family farms?
Yes, family-owned farms are still the majority of farms in Kansas. There are a couple of ways that we can slice that out. If we just look at family or individual farms, that's only about 83% of total farms. But when we factor in partnerships and corporations that are still held by the family, that puts it up to about 93% of all farms in Kansas are technically family-owned farms.
And as we're talking about these farms in Kansas, what counties have the most farms?
Well, Reno County would be the county with the most farms. They're at 1,543 farms. The rest of the top 5 would include Butler, Sedgwick, Miami, and McPherson counties.
From all these different farms, from all the different counties, what type of land is being used in those farms?
The primary type of land would be cropland. So of the 44.8 million acres in the state, 28.3 million of those acres were cropland. 14.7% were permanent pasture. And then there was a few other woodland or other type of acres that would make up the rest of that.
And being from Kansas, as many people know, that there's a lot of different sizes of farms because there's a lot of different types of operations. And so what different sizes of farms are you seeing in the census?
So for the census, we break it down into size groups. There are about seven size groups, ranging from the bottom end, 1 to 9 acres. Then the top end would be 2,000 acres or more. Those very small farms, there's about 2,500 of those across the state. The very large farms, the 2,000 acres or more, there's a little over 6,000 of those farms in the state. The size group that has the most farms would be in the 50 to 179 acre range. So looking at those size groups a little deeper, the size group with 2,000 acres or more with a little over 6,000 farms, that's about 11% of farms in the state, but they make up 64% of the land, the ag land in the state. If we go down to the size group with the most farms, the 50 to 179 acre group, there's about 16,000 of those farms, which is about 29% of all farms in the state, but they're only operating about 4% of the land.
Doug, moving on to talking about some economics from the Census of Agriculture and how much value of production these different sized farms are having.
So again, we break this down by group. It's by cells this time instead of acres. The largest group would be farms that sold less than $2,500 worth of ag products. There's about 16,000 of those. They make up about 29% of all farms, but they only contribute less than 0.5% of all sales dollars coming from farms. If we go to the largest group based on sales, those that are selling $5 million or more of ag products, they make up about 0.6% of all the farms across the state, but they're contributing 55% of all agricultural sales across the state. So the large farms are selling a whole lot of agricultural goods.
And when we talked about what county has the most farms in it, it was Reno County, but looking at it with a different perspective of who is having the total value of agricultural production.
Well, if we think about dollars produced from agriculture, we look out to western Kansas primarily because we have feedlots, we have some dairies. So the number one county in total value of production was Haskell County with $1.6 billion in ag production in 2022. The rest of the top five would include Scott, Gray, Finney, and Grant counties.
For those, are we usually seeing crop or livestock production?
Primarily livestock. If we look across the state, livestock accounts for about 2/3 of all ag sales. It varies year to year, of course. If we look back at the last 4 times that we've conducted the Census of Agriculture, that split has been roughly 2/3 value of production coming from livestock and about 1/3 from crops. And we're right there in 2022 with 65% coming from livestock and 35% from crops.
And as we're talking about livestock, usually cattle for Kansas.
Absolutely. Cattle is king in Kansas.
And as we rank Kansas within all of our other states across the country, Kansas is number 2 for cattle.
That's correct. And cattle contributed $13.6 billion of ag products sold in Kansas in 2022, and that's out of the total market value of all ag products sold of $24 billion. So it is a large chunk. The number 2 commodity in Kansas was corn, and that's only down at $3.4 billion. So compared corn to cattle is a huge jump between the two in value of products sold.
A couple other products that Kansas is really highly ranked in is also wheat.
Wheat, yes. If we talk about winter wheat, Kansas is absolutely number 1. But if we talk all wheat, because that's what factors into the sales, Kansas is number 2.
However, there is one crop that Kansas does rank number 1 in.
Yes, and that's sorghum. Kansas is the number 1 by far in acres of sorghum production and the value of sorghum produced.
When we're talking about sales, how many different farms are in different levels of sales?
We break that into 7 classes of sales. There are, again, the smallest is the sales of less than $2,500. There's a little over 16,000 of those farms in the state, and that's by far the largest group. The smallest group would be the high end, the $5 million or more, and there's about 330 of those farms in the state.
All of this sales incorporated into something for farm income. And how does 2022 farm income compare to 2017?
We saw a big jump in farm income from 2017 to 2022. There's a lot of factors at play there. 2022 was a drought year. There were still some things coming left over from COVID. So expenses were high, sales were high. The value of ag products sold in 2022 was about $24 billion in the state of Kansas, and that was an increase of 28% from 2017.
And also we saw an increase in production expenses as well?
Yes, there was a big jump in production expenses. That was about $21.5 billion in 2022, and that was an increase of 27% from 2017.
And when we look at farm income, farm-related income had the biggest change.
Yeah, percentage-wise, the farm-related income was about $1.2 billion. That doubled from 2017. And so farm-related income are things like custom work and other types of ag services that are produced on the farm, operations that are receiving cash rent or share rent payments. Maybe they're selling forest products, not a lot of that in Kansas, but it is included in that definition. Farms that have agritourism and recreational services are included in that category. And then some other things like patronage dividends, refunds from cooperatives, crop and livestock insurance payments, things like that.
That was state statistician for Kansas with the USDA, Doug Bounds. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Doug as we continue reviewing the Census of Agriculture data from 2022. If you are reaching your destination now, however, and aren't going to be able to finish the rest of the show, as always, you can find the full show and previous shows on agtoday.net or the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to that short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and discussion of the Census of Agriculture data from 2022 with state statistician for Kansas with the USDA, Doug Bounds. Doug, as we continue talking about this data, something really important to agriculture as we continue to advance is internet access.
It's a big topic in Kansas. There's a lot of interest in rural access, rural broadband access, and included in that would be farms with internet access. In the state of Kansas, 79.5% of all farms reported that they had some sort of internet access in 2022. That was up slightly from 2017 when at that point we were 76%. So we made an increase, but it was a small increase. The thing that sticks out to me the most is the jump in operations that were reporting they had mobile internet access. That's at 62%. That jumped up from 39% back in 2017.
An interesting statistic that I saw within this, dial-up is still on here for our stats.
We had 2% of the farms report that they still were using dial-up service. So I think that speaks to the need for better broadband internet access across the state, for sure.
And as we're talking about Census of Agriculture stuff from 2022, wanting to also mention some demographics of farm producers, and we didn't see a big change in average age for our producers.
That's correct. Average age only ticked up slightly. Average age of the Kansas farmer in 2022 was 58.2 years, up just a tenth of a year from 2017. If we go back to 2012, we saw a larger jump from 2012 to 2017 of about a year and a half in age. So we've slowed down that aging quite a bit.
As we're talking about the average age of producers, seeing it go from 58.1 to 58.2, and is there a race that you're seeing kind of push that increase?
Yes, that increase is pushed by white producers across Kansas. That's what most people would associate as the typical Kansas farmer. That group increased 0.3 of a year in age from 2017 to 2022, but all of the other races reported saw a decrease in average age between 2017 and 2022.
Also wanting to mention young producers and how they differ from the conglomeration of all producers.
So we define young producers as anyone under 35 years of age. There were 9,700 of those reported in the 2022 census. That makes up about 9.6% of all producers in the state. The average age, as one would expect, is quite a bit less than 35 years. It is 28.8 years of age.
And what's their average farm size in comparison to all farms?
So this group, as on average, is operating a larger farm than the typical Kansas producer. The average farm size for young producers was 916 acres, and that compares to 804 acres for all farms.
And so maybe passing down of generations, would that possibly explain that?
I would think that probably explains a big chunk of that, yes.
Young producers, then also wanting to mention the new and beginning producers. And what are new and beginning producers?
New and beginning producers, our definition is anyone that's been operating a farm or ranch for 10 years or less.
How are they comparing to all farmers?
There is about 28,500 of those new and beginning producers across the state. That is about 28% of all producers in the state. Their average age is 46.6 years compared to the 58.2 years across all producers.
And while we saw young producers having larger farms than the average producer, these guys have a little bit smaller?
Yes. Now, there is overlap between the two groups, between young producers and new and beginning producers. But on average, the farm size for these new and beginning producers is 528 acres compared to the 804 acres for all farms.
And another demographic to mention while we're talking about this is male and female producers and the change you guys have seen in that when looking at this data.
Yes, we have seen an increase in the number of both male and female producers reported over time. Part of that is due to how we've collected the data. We have been asking the operations to give us information on their primary 4 producers. Due to that, we saw an increase in male producers of 3.8%, but we saw an increase in female producers of 5.8%.
What statistics are you seeing for male and female producers?
Well, across the state, we saw 34,579 female producers compared to 66,076 male producers. Breaking that down, the average age of the female producer in Kansas was 58.5 years, while the average age of male producers in Kansas was 58.1 years. So the average age of the female producer is a little bit higher than the male producer. If we look at the number of farms operated, females are operating about 30,600 farms compared to males operating 52,500 farms.
And with that, are you seeing them operating farms that maybe aren't the big production ones that are traditionally seen?
Generally speaking, the average farm size is smaller for females at 658 acres compared to males operating the average farm size of 834 acres.
And one more demographic for us to talk about are producers with military service.
Yes, in the state of Kansas, we have a little over 8,000 producers that reported having some sort of military service, whether that is active or previous military service. That makes up about 8% of all producers in the state. Their average age is a little bit older. That average age is 68.7 years. So there's a lot of people that are probably retired from other professions, occupations, and that still consider themselves a farmer. So their average age is about 10 and a half years older than the average of all across all farms.
Doug, as we kind of round out today's conversation, talking about the 2022 Census of Agriculture, are there other items to note for our listeners?
Well, in the state of Kansas, there are some things that I think a lot of people would be interested in. If we look at crop acres planted to cover crops, we saw an increase of about 38%. So that jumped up from a little over 500,000 acres to about 770,000 acres across the state. If we talk about conservation tillage practices, there we kind of saw a swap between no-till practices and reduced tillage practices. Crop acres using no-till practices jumped up about 600,000 acres, and then we saw a decline in the crop acres using reduced tillage of about 300,000 acres. Of course, 2022, as most people remember, was a drought year, so we saw an increase in cropland that was felled or abandoned. That jumped a little over 200% from right around 500,000 acres to more than 1.6 million acres. Some other items of interest, we did see a decline in the number of equine that were on farms and ranches in 2022 compared to 2017. But I want to stress that that isn't all equine across the state. Those are just those that are located on operations that meet the definition of a farm. So there are a lot of equine that reside across the state that we are not counting. A couple other things. We saw a sizable increase in the pounds of honey collected. In 2017, we were about 444,000 pounds. That jumped up to 846,000 pounds in 2022. And then we also saw an increase in the farms that have some sort of renewable energy system, and that increased about 24%.
And Doug, we talked today about what it looks like for the state and county for the Census of Agriculture data, but are there some more releases coming out this year that maybe break it down in different ways?
Yes, we will continue dissecting this data, and we'll publish some more information. On May 15th, we will publish at the congressional district level, so that will be available to all of the congressmen and women across the country to see how agriculture stacks up in their district. Then in July, we will publish at the watershed level, and on November 7th, we will publish by zip code.
Doug, if people have any questions about this, can they reach out to you, and how can they do that?
Absolutely. They can contact me at 785-260-1508 or email me at doug.bounds@usda.gov.
Doug, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and walk us through the 2022 Census of Agriculture data.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm always happy to be here.
That was state statistician for Kansas with the USDA, Doug Bounds. If you'd like to see the full report and other state reports, you can find it by going to www.nas.usda.gov. Again, that is www.nass.usda.gov. If you have any questions about the census from our conversation or by looking at the report, you can contact Doug at 785-260-1508. Again, that is 785-260-1508, or you can email him at doug.bounds@usda.gov. That is doug.bounds@usda.gov. I will link all of that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. I would also like to remind you about a tool from the Mesonet here at Kansas State University, and that tool is the Fire Danger Forecast. You can find it by going to the Mesonet website, mesonet.ksu.edu, and then clicking on the upper left-hand corner and selecting Fire and the Fire Danger Forecast. I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Many fruit trees can be successfully grown in Kansas, but success starts with thoughtful planning and preparation, including selecting the right varieties for your region's conditions. For the March 6th K-State Garden Hour, Rebecca McMahon, Extension Local Food System Program Administrator, and Anthony Reardon, Johnson County Horticulture Small Farms Agent, will discuss the best fruit tree selections for Kansas, varieties to be on the lookout for, and how to plant and care for them. Anthony, first off, when it comes to fruit tree selection, what are some of the primary considerations?
Well, specifically when it comes to Kansas, there's such a vast environment that you're working with. On the west side, we're very drought-stricken, we're very dry, very windy. There's a lot of considerations as you move eastward, and you have pretty much the exact opposite conditions, right? So there's a lot of, just different factors to take into consideration when it comes to fruit selection, but hardiness is going to obviously be your biggest one.
In terms of the planting process, what are some things that we need to keep in mind?
Specifically when it comes to fruit trees, it's very similar to planting normal trees, but there are some nuances to it, right? You're trying to optimize fruit production in general. So you're going to need to be protecting your grafts to your tree. You're going to need to be taking protective measures so that the tree is optimizing its nutrients at the right time of year and it's not putting them towards the wrong things. Generally, when it comes to spacing and when it comes to fruit trees in particular, you're going to want as much maintenance space as possible without exposing the tree to, environmental conditions. So it still needs to be a little bit protected, but you still need to have that space to get in there and do the work.
In terms of caring for the trees, what needs to be done once they've been planted?
Pruning is a very big factor to take into consideration with your fruit trees. This time of year, while the trees are dormant and not frozen, is actually the time of year to be pruning your fruit trees. That is because they're not going to essentially notice being pruned at this time of year because they are dormant. But if you were to, say, prune them while they were not dormant, their nutrients would be allocated towards foliage production instead of fruit production. You want all those nutrients going towards the fruit.
When it comes to the pruning process, are there things that we need to take into account? Are we looking for branches that are crossed, or what are we really looking for?
Yeah, you want to first look for any dead wood. Never remove anything more than 30% of your live wood, because if you do anything more than that, you're going to be stressing out your tree. But cross branches that are damaged, anything that's may be, not necessarily a sturdiest branch, those are the ones to be removing. But you also want to keep in mind that all of your fruit buds for this year are fruit buds that produced on your tree last year. So the more you remove, the more fruit you're essentially removing from your tree as well.
In terms of watering, is that very similar to what we would do with any newly planted tree?
Yeah, essentially. When it comes to trees, the root zone of your tree is going to be within the first 2 feet of the soil, and it's going to taper out past your drip line of your tree where the external limbs are reaching. That said, you're going to want to water that entire area thoroughly, keep it moist but not overly saturated. And if you can take like a soil probe, just anything that can be poked into the ground and it can go down that 2 feet, that generally means that your ground has been watered well enough for that plant.
In terms of harvesting, anything to keep in mind there when we finally reach that part of the season?
It varies by the type of fruit that you're trying to harvest. That said, usually when it is time to harvest a fruit, they will detach from the tree very easily by just lifting it up at a 45-degree angle. So, obviously handling the fruits softly and not damaging it or bruising it is going to be essential. And then not ripping apart your tree as you are harvesting stuff. The fruit's going to detach easily.
And if you have not planted fruit trees before, I'm assuming this is something we enter into with a lot of planning, a lot of preparation, and also keeping in mind really how many trees we can handle at one time.
Yeah, so every type of tree that you're growing, especially with different varieties, they're going to have different considerations. There's going to be different care, different maintenance schedules associated with them. Generally, when it comes to fruit trees, there's always going to be some kind of fungicide or pesticide you're going to need to be applying throughout the year just to keep those pests off of the tree and to have the ample fruit production that you need. So keep in mind the maintenance schedule attached with these trees and how much time you're actually going to be able to devote to them.
That's Johnson County Horticulture Small Farms Agent Anthony Reardon. He and Rebecca McMahon, Extension Local Food System Program Administrator, are presenting Selecting and Planting Fruit Trees for Kansas for the March 6th K-State Garden Hour. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.